I've been certified as top 10 in ranking accuracy for the fourth year in a row, according to FantasyPros. Yeah, it happened again. So it's worth your while to hang around as I break down my 2024 wide receiver redraft rankings on the Fantasy First Down. Yep, it happened again. Honestly, very stoked to be able to say that once again, I'm in the top 10 in accuracy on Fantasy Pros. They just brought it out today, or in the last couple of days anyway. Seventh overall. This is the best I've done in the draft accuracy. They run a couple of comps that kind of go next to each other. I was top 30 in the weekly this year. It's out of about 250 people, so it's pretty solid. Last year, if you missed it, I was third overall in the weekly accuracy, and the year before that, I was first overall in rest of season. So, and top five the year before that as well. So we've been going pretty well. Hopefully, we can keep it up going into next year. Oh, and here's a couple of other badges I've won over the years as well. So obviously, going to be bringing you some hopefully pretty accurate rankings for 2024. Today, we're talking about wide receivers. If you haven't already, make sure you like and subscribe. I don't usually spend half my time talking about how great my rankings have been, but we're celebrating today. It's a very exciting day. They've finally brought out the rankings for last year's draft competition, and I'm happy to have done well. So make sure you like and subscribe on YouTube. You can also follow us on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down. That's where I release all of my rankings first. You can also find all of my rankings on our website at ffdfantasyfootball.com. You can find us on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. And finally, I write a heap of articles over at football.rasball.com as well. So I would suggest going and checking them out too. So let's talk about wide receiver rankings. And specifically today, I'm breaking down my half PPR rankings. Why half PPR? Well, very simply, that's what the Fantasy Pros ranking competition is on. So we all kind of rank essentially in half PPR, then adjust them to PPR to help you out in your leagues. But I'm talking about half PPR today. They're pretty close to PPR rankings realistically. There's a couple of players who either score a lot of touchdowns in general and therefore are going to be a little bit lower if you're playing in PPR. A couple that are kind of target hogs who will go a little bit high. But for the most part, we keep it pretty neutral. If you want PPR rankings, I can also help you out with that because I can personalize rankings to your league for a very low fee. So hang around to the end of the video. We'll talk about that a little bit more as well. But for now, let's get started and get into my rankings. So we're starting things off at the top. And to me, things get interesting pretty much straight away. I think CeeDee Lamb's the number one guy here. He was the number one last year, but I can definitely see an argument to take either Tyreek Hill or Justin Jefferson. I think the best thing about Lamb is you know what you're going to get from him. They don't have many other pass catching options there. The run game's going to struggle a little bit. They're going to have to pass it, and Dak's going to have to rely on Lamb. They're going to feed him. There's a really safe floor there. I think even with a Dak injury, he's still going to get so many targets, and this offense is still going to run okay. That's going to mean that you are going to not regret taking Lamb. So I feel like this is the safer option. I feel like there's plenty of upside there as well. We know we can finish as the number one. It happened last year. I feel like you're just getting a little bit cute if you go in another direction. I'm going to put Lamb at number one. And in a PPR league, I'm taking him second overall after CMC, though it really does depend on exactly the situation where I take him in, say, a half PPR league, for example, and what my roster looks like. So again, personalized rankings if you need help with that side of the decision. Now, Tyreek Hill comes in second. Again, it's a tough one. I think there is an argument for Justin Jefferson. In PPR, I probably would put Jefferson a little bit higher because he's going to get a little bit more target volume, but they're going to be slightly safer targets. I feel like they're going to be more aggressive with Hill. We know he's going to have a high touchdown total. He does get an amazing amount of red zone targets for a team that ran in 18 rushing touchdowns last year. He's been a top 2 wide receiver in 3 of the last 4 years. I just feel like he's so safe. And I feel like for the same reason you're taking Lamb up top, I feel like you have to take Tyreek second. I feel like there's too much to worry about with Justin Jefferson. Jefferson does slide in third, though, and my biggest concern here is the quarterback play. Sam Darnold is near certainly going to start the year. That's okay. He can create a functional offense, but is he going to give Jefferson that upside that led him to being the number one wide receiver in 2022? No, definitely not. He's going to be solid, but he's definitely not going to be that same player. He needs a more aggressive, high-powered offense around him to make that happen. Kirk Cousins was the guy to do that. He's out of town. Sam Darnold's not going to. And JJ McCarthy realistically probably isn't going to either. We haven't seen him be able to do that at Michigan. He's been more of a game manager who's really only exploded in a couple of games where they really needed him. I don't think he has the capacity to do that week in, week out. And I feel like that really limits Jefferson, especially when there's so many other weapons around by the end of the season. I'm talking guys like TJ Hawkinson, Jordan Addison, assuming he's not suspended, is going to be very useful as well. So, look, there are reasons to be concerned about Jefferson. He's still a pretty solid option, but I don't think this is going to be the same level of offense as you're going to get out of a Lamb or out of a Hill. And for that reason, Jefferson slides in third, but all three of them are pretty close. And if you decide to go in another direction, I'm not going to really argue with you too much. It's just my opinion that I'd have him third. Amon-Ra St. Brown slides in at fourth, and some people would have him lower than Jamar Chase, but I really like what he did last year. Even in half PPR, I'd still have him in this slot. I think he's an excellent PPR choice, and in PPR, I think you could even argue that he could be up there in that Jefferson region, depending on what happens. We have to feel like potentially Jamison Williams is going to get more of a role this year, but they don't have Josh Reynolds anymore. So realistically, you're taking out one guy who is getting a reasonable amount of targets and putting in another guy. Ultimately, St. Brown's still the main guy. It's St. Brown, it's Laporta, and it's the run game. And that's how this offense functions. And we're going to expect the same thing to happen this year. Very similar to Dallas, where you've got run game, top wide receiver, good tight end. In Detroit, we know they're an even better team. Obviously, they got very close to a Super Bowl last year. I do feel like St. Brown's someone you can rely upon. He does have a slightly capped upside because he's not that explosive alpha guy. He's more of a solid target hog slot guy, but I do still think that he's going to be a very safe option, especially if they have to keep chasing games again this year. Jamar Chase slides in at 5. A lot of people have got him in the top 3. I think that's a little bit crazy. We saw what happens when he doesn't have Joe Burrow, and we didn't even see him look that impressive when he did have Burrow. I think the fact that Tyler Boyd's out might help him a little bit. He might get a little bit more secure volume, and not having Joe Mixon there means they might not just incessantly run the ball anymore. But realistically, I don't think you can expect Chase to outperform this the majority of the time, or at least a good amount of the time. Whereas I think with those other guys, you feel like there's a good chance that they'll at least give you that value. With Chase, you're kind of projecting a little bit. I feel like there's probably closer to a 20 or 30% chance that he beats this projection. And for that reason, I can't have him higher than this. I just can't do it. I still think he's a better option than someone like an AJ Brown because you know this offense is going to have to pass, and because you know that Joe Burrow is a good passing quarterback. It's just we haven't really seen it all come together for Chase for the last couple of seasons. Ever since his rookie season, hasn't quite been the same. There have been a lot of good reasons for that. But until I see it, I can't put him any higher than this, even in half PPR. AJ Brown slides in afterwards. A couple of top 5 seasons is fantastic. He's a good, solid option, but there's so many weapons in this offense. Saquon Barkley coming in is going to hoover up some extra targets. Obviously, Dallas Goedert being healthy is going to help. They've got Devonta Smith coming back. They're trying to improve their third wide receiver. There's a lot of reasons to think that maybe Brown will just slide back a little bit. He had those 6 straight 100-yard games in a row last season. That really bolstered how he looked overall, but he also did look pretty average down the stretch, and I'm not sure that he's really got the kind of momentum we see going into the season that makes us think, yeah, he's going to have a fantastic year this year. I think he's just like a good, solid, safe option that you can get very late first round, but ideally into the second round, and you can kind of put him with a solid, very good running back, and you've got to feel good about that tandem. In a PPR league, he also loses a little bit of value for me because he doesn't quite get that passing volume of a lot of guys. I don't feel great about having Garrett Wilson here either. It really does fall off after the top 4 for me. Chase makes me feel a bit uncomfortable, but I can't put anyone else ahead of him. AJ Brown's clearly the number 6 for me, but it's not like there's anyone else really threatening him. Garrett Wilson slides in here primarily because I think Aaron Rodgers could really elevate this offense. Look at how Wilson did last year. He scored like 3 or 4 touchdowns, wasn't really getting the volume that he needed to be getting. I feel like that upside is there. Yes, they've got guys like Mike Williams coming in who are going to get some targets if he's healthy. Breece Hall is certainly going to be heavily involved as well. But I don't know, you got to think that Wilson is going to be that alpha guy. You got to feel like he could slide into that CD Lamb-like role. The upside is very large. The reason I don't have him this high in Dynasty, in fact, is I'm worried about what happens when Aaron Rodgers leaves, because I do think that Rodgers is going to elevate this offense. But after Rodgers leaves at the end of this season, maybe Wilson goes back to being this guy that he is here, where he's not in the top 20 even, because he's not getting that passing volume because the offense can't roll. So I do hope that Wilson is able to at least have a good year here. But once Rodgers leaves, he'll be a sell for me. So that's going to be an interesting thing to talk about in Dynasty at the end of the year, depending on what Rodgers does. In Redraft, though, to me, he's a pretty safe option, but I'd have him a little bit lower in Keeper and a little bit lower again in Dynasty. Puka Nacua had a great year last year, but he didn't have Coop Cup a lot of the time. And I feel like that is going to make a little bit of a difference. I also feel like Demarcus Robinson coming in is going to have more of a positive impact than we got from Tutu Atwell. I think the running game is going to be very heavy. I wouldn't surprise me if we see a lot more of Kyron Williams kind of coming out of the slot a little bit, and they have both he and Corum out in the field. So there are a lot of reasons to think that maybe Puka can't back it up exactly like he did last season, but he's still going to be great. And if you wanted to take him in front of Garrett Wilson, I can totally see that. I do think the upside isn't quite as high as it is for Wilson, but I certainly think that there's a very safe floor there. I think he's going to be a really good option. He's the number one for me over Cup. I think Cup's getting to that point where he's starting to fall off. And for that reason, I'd much rather Puka over him, even though that wasn't necessarily the case last season. Okay, number 9, Mike Evans. I got to admit, I was a little bit low on him last season. I kind of got convinced by quite a few other people who wouldn't be able to do it with Baker Mayfield, and that was entirely wrong. Mike Evans was fantastic last year. I wish I'd stuck to my guns and kept him high. He's so consistent just every single year because he's so good in the red zone, because he's such a big target. You know he's going to pull in numbers. He is aging a little bit, but realistically, I mean, 30 is not bad. He's still significantly younger than, say, an Amari Cooper or a Devontae Adams. They were great last year. So there's no reason to think that Mike Evans can't have another fantastic year. Can he back it up with Baker Mayfield with this new offense? I mean, there's a risk there, but realistically, we've seen how consistent he's been. We've seen how much upside there is. I'm still taking Evans inside my top 10. I feel pretty solid about this. I don't know that I feel confident, but I certainly feel like he's a little bit safer than a lot of the other guys in this region. And this feels like a part of the draft where you want that upside, but you also want that floor. And I feel like he's got a bit more floor than, in particular, this guy, Marvin Harrison Jr., obviously one of the best rookies we've seen coming out in recent years. This guy's going to be a star. There's no doubt about it. It's just a case of, can he do it in this offense right out of the gate? I think he probably can. We've seen Trey McBride be very successful with a lot of targets. I don't think Harrison's going to necessarily do it the same way, but he's definitely going to be the alpha in this offense. We know that Tyler Murray can be very good when he's healthy. We've seen DeAndre Hopkins have a couple of good years with Kyler Murray, so there's no reason to believe that Marvin Harrison Jr. can't do that. I really think that the sky's the limit with this guy overall, but I do think in his rookie season, you just have to be a little bit careful, and you can't take him ahead of guys who are very safe options. But if you're the kind of guy who likes to take risks, who likes to be really aggressive with your drafts, it wouldn't be insane to take him as high as, I don't know, the 7th wide receiver off the board. I think that would be okay. I wouldn't do it personally, but I can see why you would, and I think that would be absolutely fine. This guy's going to be a star. Right after him, a guy who's already a star, Devontae Adams. I'm very concerned that he's obviously falling off. Obviously, the whole Raiders offense was a bit of a mess last year, and it's going to be a mess again this year. Nothing much has changed. I do think that they're probably going to have a little bit less of a run game with no Josh Jacobs, but Zamir White's still going to be solid. Brock Bowers coming in hopefully creates a spark, but that's not exactly great for Adams. I'm not really sure what to expect here, but we've got to remember he's still a fantastic player. There's no reason to think he's not going to remain that way. So I do think we're going to expect another solid season for Adams, but I think he lacks the upside of a couple of the guys going in this range. It's more of a safety option. Whereas Drake London, this guy is all upside. Really like what the whole Falcons offense is looking like. A lot of people are taking him very, very, very early. I'm seeing him go as a top 10 wide receiver, like towards the first half of the second round. That's crazy. Like, don't do that. You're not getting any upside there. You're not getting any value for your pick. But certainly, take him around this range where you kind of towards the end of the second round, early third round. I think you can at least imagine a situation where London is a top 5 wide receiver. And if you're getting him this late, you're certainly getting that value there with that pick. I do think it's also very possible that he has another average season and ends up as a wide receiver 2025. I think that's within the reasonable range of possibilities. And for that reason, I'm not willing to go out of my way to get him. But I certainly think this is a guy you want on your team if you're looking for upside. And certainly in a keeper league or something like that, I feel like he has increased value as well. Brandon Ayuk, that's a whole messy situation. I'll be posting my latest update on all the off-season news in the next week or so, and there's a lot to talk about Ayuk. He's put in a request for a trade. but he still thinks he's going to be playing for the 49ers this year. It's just a total mess. I don't know what to make of it. If he goes somewhere else, that's terrible news, but I'm expecting they'll be with the 49ers again this year. I think that's by far the most likely possibility. I think in the future that won't be the case, but this year I expect him to play for the 49ers, and we've seen him pull off a wide receiver one finish, at least top 12. That's what I mean by wide receiver one finish. So you'd expect that there's a very good possibility that happens again, especially if you get an injury to a Debo, a Christian McCaffrey, or a George Kittle. That's where Ayuk really starts to show up. When all four of them are healthy, it's hard for them all to have good games. But when one's out, all of a sudden, the other three become real focal points, and that's when you really want Brandon Ayuk. Chris Olave is a tough one. This kind of goes in that same category of Garrett Wilson, but he doesn't have the same upside of the quarterback change. There's also been a lot of talk about a little bit of unrest with him and the team in general. It's hard to feel very good about him, but the talent is huge. He just has this habit of being a little bit lazy, not finishing off his routes. It's not the greatest team player. There's just a couple of dings on him there that make it a little bit concerning, but the talent's huge. If they can get this offense rolling this year, it is possible that he's going to have a very good year. I've got him lower than most. I think in most of my leagues, I'm not going to take him. But if he starts to fall a little bit, I would consider it. I can certainly see some upside here. But we're in a bit of a dead zone here where I don't love any of these guys compared to the guys we had before that. And for that reason, you just have to put someone as number 14. And I think it's Olave, but we're kind of at the start of a new tier here. Ayuk, Olave, and the guys to come after this kind of fall a long way below London because there's not that upside, and way below someone like an Adams and a Harrison. Deebo Samuel, the other 49ers player, obviously coming into this same tier as well. I feel like, again, still has that same upside. Obviously, a very different player to Ayuk. Gets a lot more checkdowns, kind of does some work after the catch, gets some carries and things like that. How that looks this year, I don't exactly know, but I suspect it's probably going to be pretty similar to last year. Where they see him fitting into this offense is a little bit confusing, but I do think he's going to have a pretty lockdown role, at least for the next couple of seasons. So for redraft, you've got to expect he's going to be a solid wide receiver too. Again, lacks the upside of a lot of the other guys in this region, but at least he's got a good safe floor from being in such a good offense. Amari Cooper was fantastic last year. Kind of want him to be a little bit higher. I don't know what's happening at quarterback. I think the fact that Joe Flacco is pretty aggressive and the fact the offense is kind of humming a little bit really helped him last year. I don't really know what we're going to expect this year, and that scares me off him a little bit. But the talent is huge. We've seen him be good for a long time, and he's still really not that old. He's still kind of heading into his age 30 region. And for that reason, I do think he's got a couple of good years ahead of him. I don't think there's a big risk of him falling off this season. So I'd happily take him in this range. I'll probably take him in front of Debo, honestly, because I do think the ceiling is a little bit higher. If we get old school Deshaun Watson, not old school Deshaun Watson doing the wrong thing, but old school Deshaun Watson playing like a good quarterback, I do think this offense could be amazing, and that he is the top wide receiver is going to be really carried along by that. But I also think it's possible this whole offense kind of craters a little bit and he struggles, and he's more of like a low-end wide receiver too. DJ Moore is someone I so want to have high. He was so good last year, but they've brought in so many weapons and he's got a rookie quarterback, and you just can't trust that. Keenan Allen's a little bit of a target hog. We know that. Rome Odunze is very good, and he's going to be solid in the red zone. They got two good tight ends. DeAndre Swift should be better in the passing game as a running back. We know that Caleb Williams is good, but realistically, he's a rookie quarterback, and rookie quarterbacks sometimes take time to settle in. They can't all be CJ Stroud. And for that reason, I don't expect that we can think that DJ Moore is going to have another top 10 season. There's just too many concerns there, but he still should be very good. He's an excellent player. He's in a great offense that should score a lot of points. I certainly think the upside's there, but I think he's more likely belongs down in this sort of range where you want him to be your clear wide receiver too. You want to have at least another wide receiver and ideally a couple of running backs or a tight end so that you can feel good about your team and know that Moore's someone that has some upside, but you're not really relying on him for top-end production every single week. Nico Collins fits into a similar category. At least he gets a second-year quarterback who we know he has good chemistry with. He was 18th last year, so there's no reason to think he can't at least pay off at this spot. Stephon Diggs coming in is a concern. It is possible that Diggs comes in and takes a bit of an alpha role. I think that's unlikely, though. I think it's more likely that Diggs is more the wide receiver 3 behind even Tank Dell, and is more likely to blow up and get annoyed about not getting enough volume. I think that Nico Collins is the number one guy here. There should be a high-powered offense, but there is reason for concern because there are so many other guys to share the targets to, and that makes him a little bit scary. So it fits into a very similar category to the other guys in this range. We're talking about guys with some risk, but certainly plenty of upside in that DJ Moore region as well. I think we're going to see a lot of Texans and and Bears players where we're not really comfortable with them because we don't know what exact role we're going to have, but we know the offense is going to be so good that we expect them to at least produce, especially in certain weeks. I think that makes them better best ball players, but I'm certainly willing to take them in this range in redraft. These two guys are definitely a tier down from Amari Cooper before that. I actually really like DK Metcalf. I'm tossing up moving him higher. He could move as high as 17 for me. I do think that he's probably going to be the alpha in this offense. I think it changes a little bit from the structure it had last year. I think Tyler Lockett gets eased back a little bit. I don't think JSN is going to really be the guy. I think we see a lot of Metcalf. We know that Geno Smith can have a good fantasy season, and we know that Metcalf's had a lot of solid fantasy seasons, top 24 seasons in a row. I feel like because he's got that in his locker, because he can also stay healthy, I do feel like the upside is there, and I kind of like the idea of taking Metcalf ahead of a couple of those guys because you know what role he's going to have in the offense. Malik Neighbors is the upside guy here. And it's hard to say that when you're talking about a New York Giant, where I expect the Giants are going to be terrible this year. I think they're probably going to be a bottom 5 team. I know not everyone agrees with that. I know a lot of homers out there are not going to be happy with me, but realistically, they're not very good. I don't think they're going to be very good this year. It's not because of Daniel Jones. I think Daniel Jones is okay. I don't think it was actually that bad, the fact that they brought him back. They gave him 2 bigger contracts, but I think at least bringing him back and giving him another couple of years made sense because he can be a solid player. I just don't know that he's going to be good enough to really elevate this offense past what it was doing last year when it was still pretty terrible. The run game's going to be worse. There's no Barkley. You've got no Waller now. Malik Neighbors has to be the guy. For that reason, I do like him quite a lot in PPR. In half PPR, he drops down a little bit for me, but I still think he's going to be a really solid player. I think he has more upside than most of the guys in this range. And you could reasonably, if you're looking for upside, take him as high as, I don't know, wide receiver 17 or something like that. Heck, you could probably even take him higher again because he actually has more accessible, really top-end upside. If everything just happens to somehow click for this offense, he's going to be the clear out for a number one guy. He really is very, very, very good and could have a fantastic rookie season, but the floor is clearly there. It's also possible the team craters. It's possible that Neighbors just generally struggles. We have seen that with rookie wide receivers. Not often guys taken in this round, but it can happen. So we do have to at least build that into his cost. And for that reason, he's a little bit lower for me. Michael Pittman, I really liked him. Then they brought in Adonai Mitchell. Mitchell's a very much a boom-bust prospect. We know there are a lot of knocks on him, especially around his football character and also his ability to manage his diabetes. And that means he could be a fantastic player for the team and a real bargain, and that would hurt Pittman. Or he could be barely involved, and that would be great for Pittman. The biggest concern here for Pittman is he was really good last year, but they had Gardner Minshew. And now they go back to Anthony Richardson. Is he going to be able to produce with a guy who's not really a passing quarterback? That's my concern. Now, this is where the upside is. George Pickens. Now, the problem, of course, here is that we know that it's kind of an average offense. We know it's not very pass heavy, but I think it's going to be a little bit more pass heavy now that I've got an actual quarterback. Russell Wilson was actually not too bad with the Broncos last year. He wasn't exactly able to elevate Cortland Sutton into anything special, but he was solid. And we're seeing that George Pickens can be a true alpha in this offense. So for that reason, I'm willing to take a chance on Pickens. I think he's going to be good this year. I think the upside is high. This offense somehow just manages to click. But I do think you're ultimately talking about a clear number one receiver in a very run-heavy offense, and that's always going to be a little bit of concern. And for that reason, I'm easing back on him a little bit. I want to put him higher because I love the upside. And there are certain leagues where if I come into this point and I've already kind of got my starting lineup a little bit set, I'd be willing to take more risk on Pickens and really go for it and take someone like him early, someone like him and Malik Neighbors, especially good upside options. But in a bit of a deeper league where realistically you're going to want a little bit more safety in those early rounds, I wouldn't be risking taking Pickens because I think the floor is too low. Cooper Kupp, this could go anywhere, really. I do like Cooper Kupp, the player, but realistically, he's not been looking as good recently. Those injuries are starting to take their toll, and I am concerned about what this season's going to look like. I think Puka Nacua is the clear number one guy, but I do think Kupp could potentially be very good again as well. I think in PPR, you take him earlier than this, but he's still a solid option. He's someone I'd happily take in those early mid rounds. And feel good about him as my second wide receiver. If I got him as my third wide receiver, I'd be over the moon. But as my second wide receiver, I'd be pretty happy with the situation, knowing that he could be really good this season and the upside's clearly there. Jalen Waddle goes into that range of all of these kind of guys who are wide receiver twos on good teams. We've got Kupp, we've now got Waddle, and we're going to have a couple more after this as well. Obviously, we know that the Dolphins had a pretty explosive offense last season. I'm not sure we're going to get the same thing this season. We saw he kind of fell off as their number two option in the passing game, but they did sign him to a solid contract. We do know that he's a clear part of their plans. We know he's been pretty good, but Tyreek Hill coming in obviously took a lot of his volume. So I feel like he just kind of sits in as that like late wide receiver 2 type. Ideally, you want to miss your wide receiver 3 because he's going to have some good weeks, but he's also going to have some really quiet weeks. Same thing with Devonta Smith. Really good offense, solid quarterback, but they're not going to pass the ball enough to really fully sustain 2 wide receivers at a high standard. But I do think Smith is still one of the better wide receiver 2s around the league because he's so talented, because it's a high scoring offense. I feel like that's really going to help. And we go to Christian Kirk, who is not who I thought I was going to say. I forgot that I had him in here as well. Christian Kirk is a very talented player who keeps getting injured, and it makes it seem like he's not very good. He's actually one of the better players in football. He's a really good wide receiver. Hasn't really had the best luck with offenses and quarterbacks, but I do think Trevor Lawrence is a solid option. Obviously, they just signed him to that big extension, so I think the same thing too. I think Kirk's going to be the clear number 1 in this offense. Whether that's good enough, I'm not sure because Trevor Etienne gets a lot of touches. I do think Evan Ingram is still going to remain a top 5 to 10 tight end. You've also got Brian Thomas Jr. coming in here. That's a lot of mouths to feed in an offense that really isn't very, very high scoring. So for that reason, Kirk's a little bit lower for me, but I do think the upside's there. I think he could have a fantastic season. It would not shock me at all if he finished the season as a top 15 wide receiver. I think that's well within the range of possibility. Zay Flowers, kind of similar situation where clearly the number 1 in his offense, but I do think the Ravens maybe dial it back a little bit this year. They tried to go pass heavy. It didn't really work, and it certainly started to get them found out later on in the season. Flowers is the number 1 guy here. They no longer have Odell Beckham Jr., which makes him a little bit clearer, but Mark Andrews should be healthy again, which will really help. I do think the run game will improve a little bit with Derrick Henry. Relying on Gus Edwards was the reason they kind of had to pass the ball a lot as well. I don't really know what they're doing with Lamar Jackson. Are they just going to finally trust him to start running again and just hope that he stays healthy? Or are they actually going to continue with this trying to make him a passing quarterback, which hasn't really been working? If they make him pass, that's going to help Flowers. But I'm a little bit nervous because there is a very low floor here. And I think the upside's capped by the nature of the offense and by the nature of his quarterback. So that makes me a little bit scared for Flowers. Here's T. Higgins. Here's the other wide receiver too I was talking about in that same category as Cup, as Smith. Look, Higgins is clearly the 4th of that group of guys. Still a solid player, has had some good years, but realistically, we saw the offense struggle last year. I think it will be better, but your upside's always going to be capped when you got Jamar Chase ahead of you. Really, if you've got T. Higgins, you're just hoping that Jamar Chase gets injured. If Jamar Chase gets injured and Joe Burrow stays healthy, all of a sudden you could have a league winner on your hands, but I don't know. This isn't really the right range to be taking shots on what is essentially a handcuff. So for that reason, I'd only really take him if you are looking for that upside, but you have some good other upside options around as well. Rashee Rice. Gosh, it's hard to feel good about him. You know, I'm a Chiefs fan, though. I do love the Chiefs, but I'm not going to let that taint how I feel about players. And honestly, very disappointed about a lot of things with this guy, but most disappointed for his fantasy value that they brought in Xavier Worthy. I think it was probably the right move. I would have been equally happy to have an O-lineman there, but I think it was probably the right move to bring him in. Obviously, they brought in Hollywood Brown. I think that was a good move as well, and that's going to affect Rice. Rice was the clear top 2 option in this offense. Travis Kelce isn't going anywhere, though, so I do think this is going to really affect his volume and whether he can still remain with enough volume to put together another top 24 season. I don't think he can. I also think there's still enough risk that some sort of suspension just randomly pops up when we'd least expect it that I'm willing to dock him a bit for that as well, even though I think that probably comes later, if at all. So Rice falls a little bit for me, but there's clearly upside here. We saw that he can be very good when given the opportunity. I'm not sure that that's exactly what's going to happen in this offense this year. I talked about this guy earlier, Stephon Diggs. I just don't feel good about this situation at all. I know he's had a lot of good years in a row. I know he's been a fantastic player, but he's a little bit of poison in the locker room. I do think he really struggles when he's not the clear alpha guy, and I don't think he's going to be the clear alpha guy in Houston, and I'm very concerned about what that's going to look like for him. So for that reason, I've dropped him down a lot. I feel like he could be the clear number 3 option. I feel like he could. It's entirely possible he gets benched. He just chucks his toys out of the cot and they bench him and decide they're not going to play him, and a whole heap of other rubbish could happen. I just think that's within the range of possibilities, and for that reason, he's a lot lower than he possibly could be. There's clearly some upside there, but I don't think it's such high upside because of how many other wide receivers there are in this offense. So for this reason, Diggs is lower for me. Just don't feel great about this whole situation. And there's Tank Dell. Tank Dell's right next to him. I like Tank Dell better as a player, but I do think that there's still that solid possibility that Stephon Diggs just insists on getting targets, forces targets upon himself, and that's mainly going to affect Dell because I do think Collins has a more secure role. I do think Dell's the better player long term, obviously, compared to Diggs, but I think just this season alone, I think it's possible that Dell kind of falls back a little bit, and this is kind of a situation where you probably want to avoid both of them, but Diggs at least has that upside of being the high paid alpha type personality that could force targets onto him. It's really hard to know what to do with the Packers wide receivers in particular this year. I think they could be pretty good. I've got Jordan Love in my top 10. I think their run game's going to be great with Josh Jacobs. I think their tight ends are very useful and solid. A couple of sophomore guys. What happens with the wide receivers, though? Well, last year, Jaden Reed was the best for fantasy by a mile, and he only played 40 to 70% of snaps. Is that going to happen again? Are we going to continue to see a lot of Wicks? There's been a lot of people saying we will. Does Romeo Dobbs start losing some snaps so Wicks can get on there and Reed then becomes the actual top 2 option? Is Christian Watson all of a sudden going to become the number 1 guy? There's so many questions there that just makes you a little bit scared, but the upside's huge with Reed. If they give him an every snap and he's able to produce like he did on limited snaps last season, he's going to be amazing. Now, both of those things are very unlikely to happen. I do think that the chance of him getting a lot of snaps is very possible. I do think the chance of him being very efficient on his snaps is possible. But if they give him a lot of snaps, the chance of him also being efficient is less likely because he's playing all those snaps. And he's being put on the field in situations where he's really not being expected to be one of the top options. And I feel like that's going to affect his output. So I think there is the chance that we do get a slight increase on what we saw last year. And that would be great. I think top 20 is within the range of possibility. But I also think there's a real chance he continues to be limited. We see a lot more of Christian Watson and he's more useful. And for that reason, Reed goes a little bit lower for me. There's a lot of people really high on Terry McLaurin. A couple of the Rasball guys really are. And I just don't see it. I like Jaden Daniels, but I like Jaden Daniels because of his legs, not because of his passing ability. I know he'll be aggressive and go downfield, but he's not going to be risky and go downfield. He's more of a good downfield passer. He's accurate, but he doesn't take big risk. And Terry McLaurin kind of needs people to do that to be really productive. Even so, he wasn't really able to be good with Sam Howell last year with the number 1 passing offense, like passing play percentage-wise compared to rush plays. They're not going to pass that much this year. I find it really hard to feel really good about any of the Commanders' wide receivers. I don't want to risk it on this situation. I think the upside's there, but it's not very high. I think this is a situation to avoid, honestly. Ken Coleman's a guy I really like, but I do think there's a lot of downside here as well. I like him a lot in my rookie rankings. It's my 4th wide receiver rookie behind those big 3. But this season in redraft, there's a significant amount of risk. But there's also a lot of upside. If he's the number 1 guy, if he takes on over for Stephon Diggs, we saw Stephon Diggs' stats just before. A heap of top 10 seasons. If Keon Coleman can be that elite alpha X guy, then he's going to be very good and you're going to get an absolute bargain. I will probably take Coleman significantly earlier than most other people will because I do think there's so much upside. I've got a lot of shares and I feel very good about that fact. I rate him as a player. I do think that the Bills actually really wanted him, but they knew they could take him a little bit lower, which is why they traded back. But he is a true number 1 option. For me, it's probably the 5th best, 6th best wide receiver in this class, probably 5th best behind Brian Thomas and the big 3. But in this situation with the Bills, I mean, he goes higher than that for me because if he is that number 1 guy, this is going to be a great situation. And if he's not the number 1 guy, who is? Because that guy's going to be great as well. They are going to have at least one good wide receiver, maybe 3. So if you don't want Keon Coleman, if you don't believe in him, take a shot on Curtis Samuel. Take a shot on Khalil Shakir. For me, it's Coleman, and it's clearly Coleman. But I do think those other guys, if Coleman's not good, one of them has to be. And there's Brian Thomas. Just talked about him. Look, I think he could be solid this year, but it's this kind of the same risk with Christian Kirk. And Christian Kirk's, to me, the number 1 guy. Brian Thomas has to fight with Travis Etienne, who was the number 2 running back last year. And I know they're talking about limiting his touches, but they're not talking about taking touches away and giving them to other positions. They're still going to have a lot of running back touches. Evan Ingram was a top 5 tight end the last couple of seasons. I expect that probably continues. Maybe not top 5, but certainly a good tight end who's going to get a lot of targets. Christian Kirk's a really good player. Where does Brian Thomas fit in? I think that he probably has the talent to force a role. And I think it is certainly possible that he makes a lot of big plays. But in his rookie season, I think there's also a real risk that he busts. And for that reason, I'm not willing to take him higher. But I think once you reach this range, you're looking for upside, and this is the sort of upside I want. So I'm going to be taking a lot of Coleman and Thomas because the upside is clearly there as long as you're getting them as bench players who you can slide in if they do hit. Chris Godwin is kind of the opposite of that. I feel like it's a little bit safer. I do think they're going to use the slot a lot more this year. That's not exactly a unique take from me. I know that a lot of people are talking about that, and that means Godwin could be better, but he didn't look great for me. He didn't look particularly explosive last year. He's pretty good around the point of the catch, but I don't know. I feel like we're not seeing the guy that we used to see. I feel like he's kind of aging out really quickly, which is kind of weird, but he was so good so young, and it's just kind of not happening. He doesn't look like that player he used to be, and I'm concerned for that reason. I also am concerned about what this offense is going to look like. I do think Baker Mayfield's good enough to back it up, not necessarily to exactly the same way he did last year when they made the playoffs, but do think they'll still be solid. But I think you want Mike Evans in this situation, and Chris Godwin comes with some risk. But if you want to take Godwin over someone like Keon Coleman over Brian Thomas Jr., for example, I think that's reasonable. He's a little bit of a safer option, especially in a deeper league. I'd do the same. And in PPR, I'm also going to have Godwin a little bit higher as well. Lad McConkey, again, another guy I'd have higher in PPR. I do think he's going to be the number one option in this offense, not because he's taking over from Keenan Allen. I think that's a really lazy take. I think realistically, he is playing the same position in the same team. It's a totally new offense. He's basically that underneath release option when they're not running the ball, and they're going to be running the ball a heap. You obviously need deep guys in that offense. They've got DJ Chark. They've got Quinn Johnston to be that kind of like big-bodied guy. They've got Josh Palmer to be that kind of like number one outside guy. But I think you really want Lad McConkey in that offense. We've seen that's kind of how the Harbaugh situation works. In his offenses, you probably want the slot guy, and that should be McConkey. I know he actually played a lot of outside receiver at college, but realistically, I think he profiles as a slot guy. I think that's what you're going to get from him. I think there's some upside here, but there's also a really real flaw, as there was for Coleman and for Thomas. DeAndre Hopkins, I mean, he's a great player. He's been a great player for a long time. I was pretty high on him last couple of years, in fact, and he's been pretty solid. He's done well. I think I've made profits from where I've gotten him the last couple of years, but I don't want him anymore. I don't like the fact they brought in Calvin Ridley. I don't like the fact that they're going with Will Levis. This whole situation's kind of ick to me. I'm really put off it. I don't want any of the Titans receivers. I'm avoiding this offense in general. Even the run game's awkward. I don't really want Titans players, I think is probably what I'm learning. Keenan Allen's been a fantastic player. I love Keenan Allen. I've got him in so many dynasty leagues. It's going to be really hard this year when I'm realistically not going to be able to start him, and I waited too long to sell him. But I don't know. He could still have some good early games, and I'm hoping that happens so I can cash in on him. But I do think over the course of the season, he is going to struggle. DJ Moore's the clear alpha guy in this offense. I do think that Rome Odunze is going to grow into a role and be very good. They got two fantastic tight ends. They got DeAndre Swift. They're going to have a good run game. Caleb Williams is a rookie. Rookies do tend to check down a little bit more, which could help Allen. But we're not talking about a guy who, like last season, was getting like 20 targets a game. That's not going to happen here. He's going to have to be more efficient, and that's not really his game. Deontay Johnson goes into an interesting situation where he goes from one bad offense to another bad offense, but at least one that's heading in the right direction, that seems to want to pass the ball a little bit more. I do think that Bryce Young could have a significantly better second year than he did in his first year, and we know that Deontay Johnson can be a real target hog. And for that reason, I do think there's a little bit of upside here. There's more upside in PPR. I'll have him higher in PPR than I do here in half PPR, but realistically, it's the Panthers. You can't feel great about any Panthers players, but if you wanted to take him over someone like a Hopkins, for example, definitely wouldn't argue with that. Christian Watson has more upside than the last three guys combined, realistically. I do think it's very possible he's a top 10 wide receiver. Sorry, no, maybe not top 10, top 20 wide receiver this year. But the reason I've not got him higher is that Jaden Reed did look really good, and I do think they could give him a lot more carries. There's been a lot of talk about Watson kind of fixing up the way he used his hamstrings. He was overusing one of them. He didn't quite have his gait right. I do think it's possible that leads to less injuries, and that leads to a better player, and that leads to a healthier player, and all of those things are going to be good for fantasy. So I can see the upside here. Just this whole wide receiver room is so messy that I'm not really willing to pay up for him. He's someone where if he falls to me, I'll feel fantastic about it. But if he doesn't, I'm okay with that as well. Gosh, I don't like this, but you're talking about the clear number one receiver in an NFL team. basically. That's the best thing I can say about this situation. Cortland Sutton's been consistently mediocre the last few years. He looked really good early on, and he just hasn't had it all come together. I thought that maybe with Russell Wilson it would be better, but because he's at least a solid quarterback. But obviously now we drop off to Jarrett Stidham or Bo Nix. Neither of those are going to be great situations. We have seen Bo Nix at least sustain Troy Franklin last year, and I mean, look, is that what you're hoping for this year out of Cortland Sutton? I guess that's the best case scenario, but I feel like this is going to be a really ugly offense where Jordan Payton just grinds away and grinds out a few wins, kind of keeps things going until he can get it looking the way he wants to. So I don't really want any part of Sutton. Jordan Addison's another guy I don't particularly like. He was great last year, but you heard me talk about Justin Jefferson like half an hour ago or whenever that was. So I don't know. Not taking the risk with Addison. I don't think it makes sense. The DUI's ugly as well. We'll talk about that again when I break down off-season news. But I don't know. I'm definitely not keen on Addison. He's a very, very talented young player. Will likely turn out to be the best of the guys that were the rookies that were drafted in that first round last year, which isn't entirely surprising. He was certainly in my top two from that group with Johnston, who I turns out I was very wrong on. Addison is someone that I just don't want to take in redraft this year, but I think long term, once they get in a proper quarterback, he could be very good. Now, I talked about how Keon Coleman could be the top Bills receiver in any of the years. That's great. I also think Curtis Samuel could be. We've seen him have some pretty darn good seasons over the last few years. You don't think of him as a guy who's had, 3 top 34 seasons in the last 5 years? That's crazy. And he was injured for one of them. And last year, he was in a terrible offense where he still realistically was the 42nd wide receiver. That's crazy. You're getting him as the wide receiver 44, and I've got him ranked really high compared to everyone else. He's going into a high-powered offense. For me, he's clearly ahead of Shakir, may even be ahead of Coleman. I love this situation. I think this is great value. I feel like you take him in the late rounds, you're going to get a bargain here. Xavier Worthy is a rookie, and that's why he's low. I do think he has a little bit to learn. I feel like that's kind of an ugly situation where you've got 3 talented wide receivers, and it's kind of hard to know who to take. Talked about how difficult that is in a number of teams, and the same deal here. Same as the Texans situation, as the Bears situation. Look, when you get 3 good wide receivers and there's no clear roles, it's really hard to know who to go with. At least in this situation, you got Patrick Mahomes, but I feel like for now, Worthy's probably the third cab off the rank. But I do think he has a little bit more upside than Marquise Brown. I feel like he could be very explosive. He could be the top number 1 option, but I feel like for the most part, it's probably going to be Rice. Oh, look who it is. It's another Chief. It's Marquise Brown. Look, Hollywood's been struggling the last couple of years. He's had injuries. The Cardinals have been poor. He hasn't had Kyler Murray at times, but the talent's there. And a lot of people have him a lot higher than this. I don't see that. I don't know why you'd have him significantly higher than this, but I do think he's still going to be solid. I feel like he's going to be a good, solid option that you can probably use on bye weeks. He's got some upside because it's the Chiefs' offense, but realistically, he might be the 4th or 5th pass catching option. So I can't have him higher than this. I talked about Amon-Ra St. Brown earlier. I talked about how Josh Reynolds left. Jamison Williams kind of comes into that role, but he's a very different type of player, more of an explosive deep threat. He could be very good. He's had some injuries the last few years. I talked about him in my breakout wide receiver video, so I'll kind of leave it at that. You can go watch that video if you want to hear my thoughts more on Williams. I talked about my love of Keenan Allen earlier. I'm also a big fan of Tyler Lockett, got him in a lot of dynasty leagues, and it's hard for me to recognize that he just ain't that guy anymore. He might be the wide receiver 2 for a while, but I do think JSN starts to take over as the season goes on. But there's still some upside there. I mean, I know he's 31, that's scary, but I also think that he's a really talented player who's in a solid offense. I do think Metcalf takes over that number 1 role, but look at where you're getting him. You're getting him in the late rounds. And so there is some value there. We're talking about a guy who has had a lot of good fantasy seasons in the past. I feel like it probably ends here. But, I mean, take a risk on a guy and you can drop him and get someone else if it doesn't work out. I do think there's enough upside that it's reasonable to take him in this range. I talked about not wanting any part of the Titans. This is really low for Ridley. You're not going to get Ridley if you draft using my rankings. And you're welcome and you can thank me for it later. Adonai Mitchell is a very talented rookie, but there's so many concerns. I talked about him earlier. I talked about the character issues, talked about the way he manages his diabetes, but he could have been a first-round pick, and he had enough talent to be a first-round pick. In fact, in most mocks, about a month out, he was still the number 1 pick. It was really only when we started to see the coaches get involved and start talking to the scouts that he started to move down a lot of teams' big boards. And for that reason, he fell all the way to the Colts at 52 overall. That's late second round, which is great value for them because if he hits, he's going to be an extraordinarily talented player. I think arguably he's a better player than Xavier Worthy. There's just so many concerns about him. The problem is he goes into an offense where he's clearly behind Michael Pittman, who they paid big. Anthony Richardson's not exactly a pass-heavy quarterback, so there's a lot of reasons to be concerned about Mitchell, but the upside's there, so I'm willing to take him late and take a shot. Now, I didn't make graphics for everyone else because, frankly, I don't have time. I've got other things to do. And you can see it's already dark outside. Like, it's gone from literally like afternoon to evening here in Brisbane where I live. Incidentally, host of the 2032 Olympics. You are welcome, world. So let's talk about these guys quickly. Rome Odunze, very talented player. Love him long term. Not this year. With Caleb Williams, with so many other talented players around him, I don't see it happening. Once Keenan Allen's out of town, once he can at least be a top 2 option, I'll like him a lot better. Jacoby Myers was sneakily good last season. It's just there's less upside. But if you want a really safe option, he's a great option. Joshua Palmer could be the number 1 guy with the Chargers, but with the way that offense runs, I don't think he will be. Brandon Cooks is here because he needs to be somewhere. I've got him down as the Patriots, which obviously wrong. Just ignore that. Obviously, we know he's with Dallas. Look, he's going to be fine. He's going to be a guy who's going to give you bye-week value if you need him, but go for more upside. I think you're better off going that way. Jackson Smith-Njigba, I think, could take over from Tyler Lockett, but he was disappointing last year. I think the upside's capped by that offense and his role in it, so I'm not willing to put him higher. Jerry Jeudy, there's so much downside here, but there's a little bit more upside than most of the guys in this range. He is probably the clear number 2 wide receiver in Cleveland. And if Deshaun Watson looks like old Deshaun Watson, as I talked about with Amari Cooper, Jerry Jeudy's probably going to be very good as well. But we also need Jerry Jeudy to look like Jerry Jeudy looked in college as well. He was a first-round pick, and he hasn't been playing a bit like it for a long time. He's been complaining about not getting enough money, not getting enough targets. He needs to play better. He needs to sort out his attitude, and he needs to get better. I'm talking to you, Jerry. Sort yourself out. Just below him, Mike Williams, who just needs to sort out his injuries, realistically. Look, if he's healthy, he's going to be really good in this offense, and he's got to really pay off here. But the chance of him being healthy and actually paying off with Aaron Rodgers also being healthy and playing well is low. But there's upside there, so I'm willing to take him late in drafts and just see what happens. Xavier Legette, I love Xavier Legette. If you watched any of my rookie or draft coverage, you know how much I love him. Really hoped he'd go to the Chiefs. That was my number 1 goal. Hope he would take over as that big target, even though it's actually not that big, from Travis Kelce. He does that in Carolina instead. I feel like he's going to be more of like he's going to have some big weeks. Very good after the catch. He's quick. Look at his highlights. They're fantastic. It's really fun to watch. Probably my favorite player to watch outside those top few stud wide receivers from this year's wide receiver class. He's a really fun guy to watch. Very good around the contested catch. Makes some spectacular catches. I like him, but you can't take him earlier than this. It's the Panthers. Ew. Jahan Dotson was awful last year. Will he be better this year? Maybe, but he's going to need this offense to take a step up. I like Jaden Daniels for fantasy. Don't like him so much for the offense. For that reason, Dotson comes quite low. Shaheed Rashid, I mean, he's got to be the number 2 wide receiver in New Orleans, but that doesn't have that much value. They don't pass the ball much. Their real true number 1 wide receiver is kind of Alvin Kamara, or maybe number 2 if you think of Chris Olave as being the top guy. And then it's just a whole lot of rubbish after that. Rashid will have some good games. Shaheed, I guess I should say, will have some good games, but I'm not willing to take him for fantasy. There's going to be too many total dud weeks. Romeo Dobbs is another guy I'm worried about losing his job to Wicks, so he's low for that reason. Jalen Polk goes into an ugly offense. He'll be a starting outside guy, but the targets in New England are going to be all over the place, which is why I've got all 3 of them kind of down in this 60 to 70 range. I feel like Pop Douglas has some good check down games, and he's better in PPR. Kendrick Bourne, we know, has some boom games, but again, it's just going to be a real mix where the whole offense is going to struggle. Gabe Davis, we kind of know who he is now. He has some massive games and he sucks most of the time. In Jacksonville, we'll see what happens, but I think it's going to be another one of those situations. I don't think he becomes the new Zay Jones. I think he becomes their new Gabe Davis, where all of a sudden he's having those big games occasionally, but a whole lot of zeros as well. If you like donuts, he's a good player for you. He's more of a best ball option. I do think the Falcons are going to be interesting. Darnell Mooney's probably the number 2 guy to own over Rondale Moore. That they could use these guys a lot more. That would be typically how this offense should function. But they've got Kyle Pitts, they've got Bijan Robinson, they've got Drake London. That's 3 good players. How do you fit in Mooney and or Moore? I'm not sure, but there's a little bit of upside there. Khalil Shakir, a lot of people like him for his upside. I don't really see it. He's kind of that late round smaller player who will have some solid games, but realistically, he's not an alpha type. You could draft him and hope to get some wide receiver 2 value or some wide receiver 3 value in some deeper leagues, but I'm not particularly interested. Roman Wilson should be the number 2 guy in Pittsburgh. I'm not sure he is. It could be Calvin Austin. That's why he's a little bit lower than this. But if he is, he could pay off. He could take over that Deontay Johnson role and at least be a functional bench option for you. Adam Thielen was great at times last year and overall actually pretty darn great. Still finishes the wide receiver 15 or something crazy. It's going to be a little bit better in PPR, but I think honestly they start to phase him out of the offense, get Mingo back involved a little bit more. Demarcus Robinson, number 3 guy for the Rams. The top 2 guys are the guys you want. But in that offense, the number 3 guy doesn't have no value. So at least he's someone who's going to have some good weeks. And especially if Cup goes down again or if Puka goes down again, Robinson could really pay off. So there's at least a little bit of upside there. And that is my top 70 wide receiver rankings. Gosh, that was tiring. Whew, I hope you enjoyed it. Look, I mean, you can see it's literally gone dark outside. So it has been a while. Thank you for hanging around and listening with me. If you need help with your rankings, then you need my personalized rankings. The way this works, it's really simple. You tell me your league settings, and I will write rankings especially for you. They're exactly for your league. You basically just draft off a list. Top guy on the list, you take him. I'll also give you a whole heap of draft tips to make sure you're getting good value, to make sure you're not kind of filling up too much at the wrong positions, making sure that you're kind of getting the right positions at the right time. All of that stuff for one very special low price of $10. A lot of good feedback from this last year, so we're bringing it back again. I know that it'll really start to build up in the next couple of weeks, but it would be helpful if you get your name in early because I do sometimes fill up, and at certain times of the year, I'm not able to take more bookings for it. So if that's something that interests you, make sure you hit me up. Email me at benwasley23@gmail.com. And if you're still hanging around, thank you. Thank you for hanging around. Sorry that my camera has kind of chucked a hissy fit because it's gone dark and I've got lights going on everywhere. If you haven't already, please make sure you like and subscribe on YouTube. You can hit me up on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down. I answer all of your DMs on Instagram and on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. Our website is ffdfantasyfootball.com. My full redraft rankings will be up there very soon, and you can already find my dynasty and rookie rankings as well, along with a whole heap of articles. My articles are mostly over there at football.rasball.com. They have a lot of great tools you can use to help you in your research as well. I do hope that you'll be back next time for what should hopefully be a shorter video on tight ends as I continue to celebrate what's been a great year of ranking for me. Thank you for joining the Fantasy First Down fam. I look forward to seeing you next time.